Troy Hadeed is an author, a teacher, a yogi, an entrepreneur, a traveler, and above all else, human. I honestly don't have enough amazing things to say about Troy, but what I will say about this episode is that when I was going back and editing it and basically just re-listening to it, it was one of those episodes that really left me with a sense of calmness and just a pure knowingness that I'm everything that I need to be right now, and I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be right now. And so I hope everybody else that listens to this gets that same feeling from it. He's got so much wisdom and so much knowledge to share with the world, and I'm blessed to have been able to meet him and record this episode. So I hope you guys enjoy.
My entire life, I've grown up, I'm 7 years the youngest of 3 brothers. So in a lot of ways, I kind of grew up as a kind of like an only child in some ways.
Mm-hmm.
And I've always, from my family, felt supported and loved. And even my community and my friends, I've grown up with this constant support. Even when people thought I was a lunatic or thought I was out of my mind or whatever it was, because my views are not, even in our culture in Trinidad, by any means normal or expected. They're very out of the box.
Yeah.
But I've always felt safe and secure among my family and my friends. And that is a massive privilege. And I think when someone feels safe, when you grow up with this kind of safety, it's a lot easier to open yourself up.
Yeah.
You know, because you don't easily feel threatened, right? So you don't always feel like you have to protect yourself and put up walls. And I think this had a lot to do with shaping who I am as an individual, you know?
Yeah, hearing you say that makes me just kind of reflect on my own experience. And I did not grow up feeling like I was always loved and supported for being who I was and expressing myself. I always felt like I needed to fit into the mold that my parents thought were best for me. And it's not their fault by any means. It's their own subconscious programming of them not ever having their needs met and then trying to project what they think they would have liked onto me in order for me to live a better life than them, not understanding obviously that, you know, they needed to kind of do that inner work first in order to actually feel themselves authentically. But I kind of think to my own experience of not feeling that love and support and then kind of growing up and then having to undo, I guess, a lot of that programming to really find myself, because you seem like somebody who's very in touch with themselves. And that is, again, another thing that sort of drew me to want to have this discussion.
Now, Tom, do you have brothers and sisters?
I do. So I grew up in a house of divorce. So very, very early divorce. I think I was around 2 years old when my parents, you know, made the decision that they were going to get divorced, and it was ugly. They fucking hated each other. I had one older brother at the time, and then my mom started dating my stepdad pretty shortly after the divorce, and he already had 2 kids of his own who were 2 years older and 4 years older than me. And then my dad eventually remarried and then had more kids who are 10 years and 12 years younger than me. And I was, you know, I'm the classic middle child definition of just kind of being there and just being confused and trying to fit in and never really feeling safe. And I still see a lot of that unconscious programming that's like coming up through me is, you know, understanding where I came from and then giving myself that love that I was scared to receive as a kid because it didn't feel safe.
Yeah. You know, it's so interesting, Cam, because I said like I was 7 years the youngest, but you know what else that means? That means that, you know, my mom had me at 40.
Wow.
Right? And my parents have been married for over 50 years. They're still alive today. So it shows the difference in conditions in which we both grew up, right? And for me, growing up 7 years younger, when my mom and my dad were in their 40s when I was born, I think what that did is gave me a lot of freedom.
Yeah.
Because while I was rattling what was expected and what was normal, they'd already had 2 kids already, 7 years ahead of me. They've been through all of it. It's almost like my brothers came and they just cleared the way. So I just came along 7 years later and had all this freedom to kind of turn stuff upside down,
Mm-hmm.
and all that really shapes, who we are and the conditions we grew up in. And it's just so interesting for us to look back and see what made us who we are and what privileges or disadvantages we had that shaped us and where we need to do a little bit more work.
Yeah, absolutely. And like that's what it really comes down to is just doing that inner work, which we talked about a little bit before we started recording, is just
Yeah.
you've always wanted to gain that inner awareness through whatever types of practices. And I very much understand that yoga is the main practice that you've been using pretty much throughout your whole life.
Yeah.
How did
Since
you
yeah.
I guess how did you start, like what's your relationship with yoga when you began and kind of what is it now?
Well, before I jump into that, Cam, you know what? Because you're saying that and this landed for me, and it's important for us to recognize, because I think if we begin to see life this way, it goes beyond, this is way beyond me and you, right?
Yeah.
But because I grew up in an environment that for me felt safe and gave me the freedom, because I felt safe, I was able and in a position to go and look for all these, to start doing the work from a really young age, because my basic needs were met. I was taken care of, right? Never did I feel like I had to fit in, or, like I mentioned to you, Trinidad is a very much a drinking culture and a partying culture. And all my friends had been drinking from 14. And I've never drank up to this day. I'm 42 years old. So that too shows a level of safety that I never felt I had to do anything I didn't want to do to fit in. And
Yeah.
that's really important. But to answer your question regarding yoga, I started actually practicing yoga regularly at probably about 25 years old. Now, when I say yoga, I talk about yoga postures, which is usually what the Western world refers to when they say yoga.
Hmm.
But if I really look back, my initial influence of yoga was way, way before that. I grew up in a Catholic home. And even then, I pushed against the boundaries of religion because none of it made sense to me. What did make sense to me was the teachings of this man called Jesus.
Yeah.
What then didn't make sense to me was the box that organized religion put around the teachings of Jesus. But we won't get into that right now. But so I like to say that before I started practicing postures, I understood yoga, because to me, Jesus is one of the greatest yogis that ever walked the planet. And I understood his teachings, what it meant to embody love, compassion, understanding, what it meant to see God in everyone and everything. This is the fundamental teaching of yoga. Postures is just a means in which we can learn to embody that, right? Cultivate a relationship to our mind and our breath that helps us get our head out of our ass so we can actually embody that stuff, right? But what's really interesting too with regards to yoga is, I've been teaching now for about 15 years. And anytime whenever I travel, people always ask, well, how do you get into yoga? And I have been talking about one of my teachers when I was 14 years old. I was in what we would call secondary school, which is like high school for you guys. And one of my teachers, his name was Mr. Hadeed. And all I remember was going up every lunchtime, like giving up my lunchtime to go and sit with him. And he would give me these books to read, all of these books to read. And they were all Eastern tradition, Eastern culture, yoga, Buddhism, all that kind of stuff. And I up until a few years ago, I always said I wish I could meet him again to tell him how he could have possibly influenced my life at 14 years old. And a few years ago, I just come back from teaching in Slovakia, and I get this email in my inbox, and it comes as a comment from my website, and it says, "I think I gave you Practice of Brahmacharya to read in 1994.
Oh my gosh.
Ask Hadeed." And I look at this, I'm like, now, by the way, all my comments from my website used to go to junk because they all used to be spam. And for some reason, somehow this one came through. And I was like, no way. And I replied to him, and I was like, "Mr. Hadeed, send me your number, blah, 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 blah." And he sent me his number, and I called him right away. And he says, "First of all, Troy, let me get your story straight for you." He said, "You were sent to detention." He said, "That's how you first came to my room. You were sent to detention." And he said, "I gave you the Practice of Brahmacharya to read as a joke, because the Practice of Brahmacharya is a text around sexual conduct and sexual misconduct, right?" So he's like, "You're a 14-year-old boy. I gave you that to read as a joke." He's like, "I don't even do yoga. I don't even practice yoga. I'm not a Hindu. I have no knowledge of yoga." To him, it was a complete joke. And he said, "I sat down there and I devoured this text that, in his opinion, most adults couldn't even read." He said, "After that, I came to detention of my own free will every lunchtime."
So his class was the detention class.
That was one of his classes, yeah. He handled lunchtime detention. And he said, from that day, I came up to detention of my own free will just to read more and read more and read more.
That's insane.
What's really beautiful is he says to me, he says, "Troy, I've been talking about you for the last 20 years.
No way.
So he now teaches in Canada, in Ontario. And he said to me, "I have been referencing this 14-year-old boy, Troy Hadeed, for the last 20 years as the way in which his commitment and the way he impressed me with how he showed up." He said, "Look at that. You've been talking about me, and I've been talking about you. And we've had no contact for over 25 years. He said, how I found you is that I was talking to my class about this 14-year-old boy called Troy Hadeed from 1994, and they Googled your name. And when your website came up and they showed me that you were an international yoga teacher," he's like, "I almost fell off my chair," because he had no idea what had come of my life. And it's such a beautiful story and a reminder that everything we do impacts the people around us, even if that's not our intention. That's how powerful we are. And if we can really understand that, it reminds us to bring more intention to the way we live our lives.
That right there has been one of the biggest teachings for me as far as how I want to continue to basically show up in my life. Basically realizing, coming from that place of, not being vulnerable, feeling unsafe, needing to feel guarded, realizing that I can't show up for others if I myself don't have my own needs met. Yeah. And I think we get very caught up in still trying to help other people meet their needs, and oftentimes we forget to actually meet our own needs. Mm-hmm. And so what plant medicine has done for me is really caused me to realize a lot of that. And so when you mentioned earlier, when we were speaking that you've never used plant medicine before, well, you already embody the teachings of it. It's, it's one of those things, like plant medicine is a tool to gain access to God or universal consciousness or just being. It's a tool for that. And so if you use it with intention for that purpose, it will help you. But, something that you also realize is that there's a lot of people that are using it unintentionally, and it's becoming a poison as well.
Yeah, you know what's really interesting, Cam, is it's interesting you say that because, like I mentioned to you, I have toyed with the idea, right? And I remember I was chatting with a shaman once, an Israeli guy who was a plant medicine shaman. And I did this one session with him just to kind of feel it out and see what it had to offer. And I mentioned to him that I was thinking about doing ayahuasca and what he thought of it. And he said, "That's not for you." And I said, "Well, why?" And he explained, "Because you've already been doing the work." He's like, "It's not, it's not gonna harm you. Do it if you want to do it."
Yeah.
But he said to me, what plant medicine has to show you, you've already seen. You already know and see the interconnectedness of reality. And it helped me realize, Cam, and even, we talked about my darkroom experience, and that was always also a massive reminder of this, is that the ego gets caught up in spiritual practice. And it's almost like plant medicine now has this social reputation almost, we've given it, that spiritual work is plant medicine and plant medicine is spiritual work. And somehow that if you're on a spiritual journey, you need to do plant medicine. And if you do plant medicine, it means you're doing a work. And that none of that is true. None of that is true. And what he was trying to tell me in my words is, don't drink the Kool-Aid. Don't feel like you have to do plant medicine and that it's going to get you anywhere else. Like if you're doing a work, you're doing a work. And I acknowledge for myself that it was in a lot of ways my ego that wanted to say, I've done plant medicine, and wanted to have that psychedelic experience, that visionary state,
Yeah.
And it's so important that we look at it continuously because those things show up.
Yeah. I mean, it sounds like that, like intuitively, you've always known that you've been doing this work. Like there was nothing outside of you that needed to tell you to do this work. It was just something that you naturally did. And having those, again, psychedelic experiences for me, it was what I felt intuitively I needed to rattle my ego. Like
Yeah,
when you have such a strong ego growing up, as I feel that I did, I I would have just kept going and repeating the same patterns until I died.
yeah,
Had again, and it didn't even necessarily have to be plant medicine, but something has to rattle the ego if you're at that part. If you're at a time in your life where you're just repeating the same patterns and you don't know how to get out of them, and like that's the disease of the mind in a way, is that it doesn't understand that if you've grown up without safety, everything that it's doing to keep you safe is actually doing the exact opposite because that's all it knows.
yeah. It's what you're saying, Cam, is so interesting, right? Now, if what I'm gonna say doesn't ring true for you, let me know. But I've been really looking at it lately because we hear now we hear this term self-love, 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 self-love. And I like to talk about self-love in this way. It's like self-love is really important. But if your self-love doesn't serve something bigger than yourself, then it's just selfish.
Yes.
But here's the thing. Because I have a lot of friends and I've been in a lot of relationships where with individuals who did not grow up with safety. They never felt loved, right? They really never experienced unconditional love and safety and security. So whereas it's easy for me to say, all right, get over self-love already, because I already know what it is to be loved.
Yeah.
But I've acknowledged that for someone who may not have grown up with that level of love and security and safety, it's important for them to really love themselves first, because they have to now experience what that love feels like. and what that nurturing feels like. And it's so easy to look at someone and say, do better, consider collective, get your head out your ass, whatever you want to say. But if someone isn't safe, if, like you said, their basic needs aren't met, and they've never felt supported or cared for by the collective, then how can you expect them to care for the collective?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That rings incredibly, incredibly true to me. And even speaking more about that safety, I think, especially Western culture, we get caught up in looking at safety simply just from the basic needs met structure still. Whereas, like, do you have food? Do you have shelter? Do you have water? Do you have clothes? And so a lot of the people that maybe have never felt self-love before, they have all of those basic needs met, but they still sort of live in a psychological state that their nervous system produces that doesn't make them feel safe.
Yeah.
Even though they have those, and it comes from the ego, it comes from the psyche. Whereas if you do X, I'm then taught to experience pain. If I don't listen to my parental figure, I'm then going to be made to feel bad for being myself. And so that gets ingrained in your memory. And, the more that happens, that gets repeated over and over again. So now I'm immediately taught, okay, if I do this thing, even though it's myself, that's unsafe. I'm going to be made to feel bad. I'm going to get yelled at. I could possibly be injured or in pain or whatever. So that's just, again, subconscious programming done. Until you then cultivate that awareness. And it's really about awareness first, is just being aware of your reactions. And like, it's not about healing immediately and being like, okay, well, I don't feel self-love, I need to do this. Like, if you start there, you're just going to make yourself, I think, feel worse. It's just about understanding how you react when certain things happen. Like, if anything in life triggers you, there's a purpose for that. Yeah. And it's up to you to just sit with that, not try to change it, just sit with that and just figure it out.
Yeah, and a lot of times people just numb it. They have all these ways of numbing and avoidance.
Alcohol.
And it's let's just start there. There's no end to where that goes, right? And I was talking to a friend last night about alcohol in Trinidad, because Trinidad is like, I told my brother the other day, it's like Trinidad needs an intervention. All of Trinidad needs an intervention, because our entire society, almost all social existence in Trinidad revolves around alcohol. Completely.
Yeah.
But that's a whole different conversation. But what I do want to put my finger on from what you just said is what I call emotional corruption. Because the most valuable currency in the world, Cam, is our attention, our support, and our love. And, we look at the world, when we think of corruption, we think of big corporation, politics, billions of dollars, untraceable accounts. That's what we think of. But where do we think that came from? Are you still there? Yeah.
And I'm trying to, basically thinking of like that to me, I guess just really quick is like, I think that need of essentially wanting to feel love and then doing things in order to feel that love from a source outside of yourself.
Yeah. And then when somebody doesn't act in accordance with how you want them to act, we withdraw that love, we withdraw that support. Think of it, Cam. It starts with a crying child that you say, stop crying and I'll buy you ice cream. That's a bribe. That's corruption, right? So for me, it's like, I understand we want to deal with big corruption, but we can start doing that by looking at how we bribe people with our energy and our love and our support, or how we do something just to fit in, almost as if we're buying someone else's love and support.
Yeah.
And that that emotional corruption, that emotional trade is so important for us to look at. Things like silent treatment. That's a bribe. You're withdrawing your love, your support, your energy from someone, trying to let them know that you're upset. That's an emotional bribe, you know?
Yeah. We all just want to feel supported and feel loved. Like any human being, we are born from love, and I'm not very religious. I think I probably
Yeah.
consider myself more Buddhist than anything right now, and I'm
Yeah.
still pretty early in learning actually about Buddhist culture and Buddhist
Yeah.
traditions. But where I'm going with that is like I think the actual teachings of Jesus very much align with the fact that we are all born from love. We are all born from God, and that essentially is what God is. And I think
Yeah.
organized religion teaches God as this idea of a deity that is separate from you, that
Yeah.
you are supposed to be receiving love from, not necessarily that like we are God. You already
Yeah.
embody God, and all of these answers and all of the teachings of Jesus are inside of you. Jesus simply just did so much inner work that he was able to see all of these things and try to tell people that this is all inside of you already.
Yeah, I mean, he did. That was his words, Cam. He said, "The kingdom of God is within you. You will do far greater things than I have ever done. What more do you want?"
Yeah.
He just said it, right? You know, two things come to mind when you say that. One is I always talk about breath, and we talked about breath a little bit before. What is really amazing to me is when I discovered that the word spirit, like Holy Spirit, actually comes from the Latin word spiritus, and it means to breathe. So it's
Huh.
like, wow. So I'll tell you how that translated for me, right? It's like God is making love to us 23,000 times a day, right? Think of it, Cam. We're on two different continents. And the air we breathe is the one thing that connects me and you. It's
Yeah.
the one thing that connects which is why pandemic was such a big deal. The air we breathe is the one thing that connects every living being and all of creation on the planet. It only makes sense that there's divine intelligence in it. Right? It's like it's connected more than blood or ancestry or opinion or name, any of that stuff. And then what it also means to me, and I love to talk about this when people bring up this new age term manifestation, right?
Hmm.
So manifestation to me is a new age word for prayer. It's all manifestation is prayer. But get this, prayer or manifestation isn't something we do consciously in the morning and consciously in the evening. If God or Spirit is inside of you in every moment, 23,000 times a day, we are living embodiments of prayer and manifestation. Everything we do is a prayer.
I was gonna
And
say, yeah. Sorry. You
yeah,
keep going.
and what we need to do is bring more attention to the way we live our lives. Because even when we're out of alignment, and we're being governed by greed or jealousy or not from a place of love, those two are prayers. Those are prayers as well. You know?
That's exactly what I was gonna, I guess, kind of say is like you saying that makes me think that, well, one, that makes a lot of sense, and I very much agree with that. And so thank you for sharing that. And if we're embodiments of manifestation and prayer 24/7, then it is up to us to get back into that true alignment. And then once you do that work to do that, that's just how things come to you. And I've even said right now, like my life is very different right now than I would have guessed it would have been even a year ago. And
Yeah.
that's because I've really tried to commit myself to just doing as much inner work as possible, which is not easy, by the way. It is, you know, like your ego wants to hang on and your ego still hangs on. And that's actually brings me to another point that we'll talk about in a little bit. But
Yeah.
um if you can connect to that true self, then everything will simply just align for you. And that's the idea of surrendering to God's will. It's not just sitting there and doing nothing. It's simply just allowing yourself to be.
Yeah. Yeah.
And what I wanted to bring up was the idea. So I want to kind of talk about the darkness retreat that you went on.
Yeah.
And so you mentioned that you went on a 10-day darkness retreat and then you left after 3 days.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's so interesting because like we mentioned, I've done Vipassana 10 days of silence before. And when I talk about 10 days of silence, I always tell people, yo, stick it out, stick it out, stick it out, stick it out. You got to cross the halfway mark. You got to cross the halfway mark. Don't leave before that. And the darkness experience for me was very, very interesting. And I left on day 3, but I always point out that I now realize it's not about 10 days. It has nothing to do with 10 days whatsoever. And for me, what I realized, first of all, it's very interesting because for that experience, for me, it was very unsafe. So I went to Mexico and the retreat center was kind of closed and it was under construction. And I lost my baggage and I was the only one in the retreat center besides the owner. And at no point in that experience did I really feel safe. I was always a little rattled, right? I have a dark room at home. Had I done it in my dark room at home, I would have had a much different experience. But in a nutshell, I think I was messed with exactly in a way that I needed to be. That experience was personalized for me by the universe or God or whatever. And those 3 days for me were agonizing. I felt like I met death. The power of the mind I've been talking about for over 15 years. And in that room was when I really got a glimpse of how powerful the mind was. Because there's, in the world we live in, we have a relationship to all the things around us. And that's what defines who we are, our relationships. But in that room, there's no relationship. It's just your mind.
Yeah.
Your mind has full control. It's almost like your mind is 100% director and producer of that movie. And whatever your mind decides is your reality in that moment, it becomes your reality. And in so many ways, Cam, that experience for me was beyond agonizing. And I experienced levels of anxiety and depression that I never thought possible. I never thought I would see anyone I loved ever again. I faced fears of psychosis and will I ever see again and all this kind of stuff. It was nuts. But I'll tell you what really landed for me, which is to me is important. One, we talked about the ego a lot. I sat in there and I realized how much my ego was keeping me in the room. Like I went in that room and that experience to shed layers of my ego and identity. And I was there in this agony, in this experience. And I was worried about what would people think if I came out early? What would they say? What would they do? I have a whole community that knows I went into this experience. What would they think of me? It was my ego that was trying to keep me in that room, almost as if I had something to prove. And then another thing that landed for me that I want to mention is this. There's an Indian saint called Neem Karoli Baba. I don't know if you ever heard of him.
No.
But he was Steve Jobs' guru. He was guru of this guy called Krishna Das. I don't know if you know Trevor Hall, amazing musician.
Yeah.
But Neem Karoli Baba, from all his stories I've heard, he never taught anybody practices. People always wanted a breathing practice, a meditation, or something to do that would get them further along the path or get them to realize God. And he never gave them anything to do. When anybody asked him what to do, he would say things like, tell the truth, serve people, feed people, remember God. That was it.
They're like, come on, man. Like, we already know all that bullshit. Tell me something else.
Yeah. And that when I was in that dark room, Cam, it really landed for me as to how much the ego gets caught up in all of these spiritual practices. I'm using inverted commas, right? If people
Yeah.
can't see. Like whether it be yoga or meditation or darkness or silence or church or plant ceremonies, almost like the more we do of these things, is the more evolved and the more realized and the more closer to God we are. And it's almost like we paint this spiritual journey like some kind of ladder we have to climb. And it dawned on me in that room that is absolute bullshit. Like it really landed for me. Like, I've been talking about it in that way, but it really landed for me. Like
you felt it, like you logically understood it before, but now you really like felt and embodied that.
yeah, like there's one practice that really matters. That is the practice of love and the practice of God. That's it. That's all that matters. Do we understand what it means to love? Can we embody that? Can we see divinity in all of creation, in the eyes of every human being, and then act accordingly? This is the practice. And we have this term we talk about like self-realization. Well, the only time realization really comes is by dissolving itself.
So
Go ahead.
what's just so interesting about listening to you talk about this is within plant medicine, the coveted experience is the ego death. Like that's what you're essentially going for. And like when people will ask, can you have these experiences that plant medicine gives you without taking plant medicine? You're living and breathing proof of yes. You do not need plant medicine in order to understand this and help you dissolve your ego. It's just, again, a tool in a toolbox that can help you get there.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely, 100% Cam. And so, I always make clear to people too, like, I'm not anti-plant medicine. Like, plant is from God. Plant medicine is powerful. I just think we need to look at how we're using it and the structure,
Yeah. So one thing that you also just said that made me just kind of think was, you said the two most important things are just love and then your relationship with God.
Yeah.
And something that you have talked about is that people need to redefine their relationship with God. So I'm curious, like, what does that mean to you, redefining that relationship?
Yeah, well, not that I think we as a collective need to, and here's why I say that, right? I often, there's so much, if we look at our world and my generation, your generation, there's a lot of people that have moved away from God. They've moved away in so many ways from God. And I speak to people all the time and they say, well, I'm an atheist. And I say, all right, cool, I get it. I understand. Like, I understand if we look at the history of religion and everything that surrounds that three-letter word God, I understand why somebody would want nothing to do with it.
That's what turned me off of religion in the first place, is like it's so unfortunate that you are taught at such a young age that God and religion are kind of the same thing, that you need religion in order to have a relationship with God.
Yeah. And of course, God came far before religion. Like, God doesn't belong to religion. That's something we need to understand. So what I invite people to do, Cam, is don't let history rob you of a relationship with divinity. That would be very sad. We need to take it back. And someone once asked me, well, is it important that do we have to use the word God? Like, can we use spirit or Gaia or Mother Universe? Or I don't think God cares, to be honest, personally, right? God doesn't have an ego issue like we do.
Yeah, no, I mean, God is egoless, and God is pure love, pure
Yeah,
light. God does not have that ego that controls us.
yeah. So my response to that is yes, you can call God whatever you want. But I think it is important that we use the word God. Because if we don't, then we're just creating more separation.
Yeah.
We're saying your God is different from my God.
Hmm.
And I'm saying, no, your God is my God. But we need to reframe it because there are a few things that you guys missed along the way. And if we don't use the word God, then we can't redefine and realign the misalignments that were done in the name of God. Like it's important for us also to use the word God and not avoid it,
Yeah.
because that's the only way we can correct the wrongs that were done in that name.
Yeah. I mean, because of religion, God is almost seen as kind of a bad word now.
Yeah. Yeah. And the thing is, Cam, like I said to someone the other day, I'm not, for me personally, how I feel is that I'm not willing to leave anyone behind. So I understand that this journey is not like a ladder I climb to God and I look down on you and say, ah, you didn't get it. That's not what this is. Like, we can't be free unless we're all free because we are so interwoven.
Yeah.
We are so interwoven that there is absolutely no separation between us, you know. And you spoke about ego death, which is important to look at it that way because it really helps you understand. But at the same time, I also know that I don't want to kill my ego. I want to befriend my ego. I want
Yes.
to create a relationship with it so that it no longer uses me like a puppet. Because to say the ego is useless is to say the human experience is useless, and it's not. The ego to me is one of our biggest teachers. You know, it's more about creating a relationship with these aspects of our egos so that we can learn and grow with it. And eventually, you know, that ego dissolves into something so magnificent.
Yeah.
But I always like when we talk about killing the ego, which I used to talk about. I almost tattooed on my skin, "Today's a good day for my ego to die," which is one of the lyrics from an artist called Nako, who I love
Hmm.
very much, you might know of. But yeah, it's so important to understand that the ego too has its purpose.
It
You
it
know?
it does, and I think, and I'm very happy that you bring that up because I think even myself gets caught up in the idea of like, oh, you need to stop listening to your ego. You need to have ego dissolution. That I almost forget that like I don't fully think that like we should not have an ego. I very much understand why we have an ego, and as
Mm-hmm.
you said, that really resonated with me is that that's part of the human experience. That's something that we have that, as far as we know, no other animal on planet Earth has an ego. We
Yeah,
are quite literally the only living beings that we know in the entire universe that has this ego. So there is absolutely a divine purpose to it. And I think that's to allow us to feel and make sense of all of these other emotions that we have.
yeah,
And that's just the beauty of the human experience. But it's so easy to get caught up in the ego that you need to be consciously aware that you and your ego are separate. You are not your ego, but you can befriend it, as you said. And that's when you can allow things to just start, making their way into place for you, and allowing the universe to unfold as it's supposed to.
yeah. I would also question, Cam. I don't know. I guess there's no way for us to really know, but I think there are animals in existence that have egos
Hmm.
because just that drive to preserve oneself is an egotistical drive,
I
right?
guess true.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I would like to believe that, but you know what's funny, and I'm sure you'll appreciate this story. This blew my mind. So lately, I've been speaking a lot in a corporate environment, public speaking in a corporate environment. which, by the way, would not have begun if I did not come out of the dark room on day 3.
Interesting.
Very interesting. I look back at it all the time. If I'd stayed those 10 days, I would have not been able to speak at that event. So interesting. Anyway, so I spoke at an event recently, and I shared with them about my darkroom experience and the power of the mind. And this lady comes and she speaks to me after, and she tells me about her son who's born blind. Now, he's 8 years old, but she explains to me the psychology of a child who is born blind. And she says that at 8 years old, her son does not understand the pronoun I. Because he's never seen things as separate from him. So his experience is almost like he's part of everything, and she has to try to explain to him what I means, and that he's separate from everything around him. And somebody said to me once when I told this story, they said, well, he'll grow up and in a few years he'll understand. I was like, no, dude. I was like, we need to understand.
Yeah.
He gets
we need to be more like him. Yeah, That's the point.
Yeah, he gets it. But it was just so interesting.
That's
right?
Incredible.
Yeah. So interesting.
I wanted to also go back, and I tried to talk about this at the way beginning, but your experience with yoga, and I want to talk about kind of what that's morphed into in Western culture and sort of why we might not really understand the actual teachings of it.
Yeah. I used to be really rigid, calm, and militant around what yoga was and what yoga wasn't. And I've begun to realize that everything is yoga. And even in the West, sure, it might be very surface oriented, and you look at all these postures and stuff. So I really hesitate now to label what is yoga and what is not, because I think everything is an aspect of yoga.
Mm-hmm.
For me, the very foundation of the practice of yoga is union with God.
Yeah.
It's that it's more of a realization that we are collectively bonded and yoked with divinity. Because once you come to that realization, every conversation, every conflict, every interaction is one you're having with God. And if we can really download that, our relationships are going to be a lot different. We would live our lives a lot differently if we really in every moment saw God, right? And, people say all the time, well, I do yoga, but not a spiritual kind of yoga. I'm like, well, that doesn't make any sense, because as long as you're breathing, you're spiritual, right? Whether you're conscious of it or not. And for me, how I see yoga, Cam, is I tell people this: yoga won't change your life, and meditation won't change your life. But yoga and meditation will give you and deepen your relationship to your breath and mind, which will deepen your relationship to God. And that will change your life.
Yeah. I think that hearing you kind of say that brings up this thought of meditation becoming a pretty, I think, popular thing over the last couple of years in Western culture. And now that I've quite recently started a meditation practice and kind of diving deep into my own spiritual journey, I think the idea of prayer in an organized religion sense and the idea of meditation is actually really just the same thing. Yeah. It's just different means of connecting to God and just a different way of looking at it. And especially in religion, we get so caught up in prayer that, oh, I have to say these specific sets of words in order for God to hear my prayer, or else it's not going to get answered. And that's how it's taught. And again, that's why I think a lot of people are turned off from religion, is because it's very, very rigid. and it
Yeah.
feels rigid, and you feel bad if you're not doing it correctly. Like there feels like there's a right and a wrong way to do it. But we're not really
Yeah.
taught that you should just ask questions and simply just be open to it. And if you just basically sit in silence and just sit
Yeah.
still, that's how you really kind of cultivate that relationship.
Yeah. And so look at it like this. It's like meditation and yoga, all of this stuff is about cultivating a relationship with the mind. In yoga, there's a teaching, mind is king of everything, but breath is king of the mind. And like we mentioned earlier, breath is also an element of God, because breath is spirit, right? But from the day we're born, we're told this narrative that I am Troy and this is my body. That gives my ego power right away, that I am an individual. And that is the narrative we're told our entire life. We're told hundreds of narratives that feed this individual identity, right? As long as we don't have a relationship to that, then we become a puppet to that individual identity, right? But let's put a finger on it. If I really believe that I am my body, then what I'm saying is that when my body ceases to exist, so will I. That's what I'm
terrifying.
saying.
I think that's
right?
terrifying for people.
Exactly. But what that also means is that they are going to do everything in their power to make their personal needs, desires, their priority in life. They will do everything in their power to preserve and protect that body. So if that is our unconscious way of living, then it becomes very selfish and self-centered, which is the world we live in. So when we deepen our relationship to breath and mind, we begin to, whether we realize it or not, we begin to cultivate that relationship and lessen the hold of the ego on us. So then we can live more intentionally, and we can begin to identify with a larger identity, an identity outside of our own individual physical body. And that's when we begin to understand what it means to love, what it means to serve.
Yeah. What's also interesting about what you just said is basically when you allow the ego to give yourself that sense of identity, you're going to do everything in your power to try to preserve that.
Yeah.
And yet the people that live very, selfishly, and that's not even the right word. I think it's just unconsciously. When you're doing that, that's when you see people do things to their body that they actually then know is bad. It's like they're actually kind of trying to kill, like people that drink a lot of alcohol, that smoke, cigarettes, that, put unhealthy things in their body. They're like, again, like they're unconsciously actually just trying to kill their body so they don't have to come to the realization that they are, I guess they're not eternal.
Yeah. Yeah. But we are. It's like the resonance and the vibration of every action, every word, every thought, that lives forever. Our names will be forgotten. At some point, no one on the planet will know our names. Even for individuals as great as, to me, like Bob Marley. At some point, somebody's not going to remember his name. Jesus Christ, at some point, no one's going to remember his name. But the resonance and vibration of their lives and their teachings and how they impact people, that consciousness lives forever.
Yeah. Thank you again to Troy for coming on the Trip Sitting podcast and for just being a super dope human being and sharing all of your wisdom with the world. To everybody that was listening, thank you so much for tuning in. If you could do me a huge favor and rate this podcast wherever you're listening to it and leave a review. And then if you could also follow it and share it with a friend, and then also follow Trip Sitting on Instagram at tripsitting.blog. And then also, if you go on my website, tripsitting.blog, and you could subscribe to my Trippy Mondays newsletter, where I share 3 things from the last week that just caught my attention every single Monday. It's a great way to start your week. So thank you again to everybody for listening, and we'll see you next episode.